Thank you. Certainly we will be reviewing the bill in coming days, but what struck us the most today is that Citizenship and Immigration Canada's citizenship policy, it's a huge area of policy. There's so many things that we could be focusing on, that the government could be focusing on in its first bill. And in its first bill today, the key beneficiary of this legislation was a man who was convicted of a plot to bomb downtown Toronto. That's our concern. I think that there could have been any numerous different policy areas that the government could have focused on today, but to focus on an area of our policy that essentially gives rights back to somebody who has been convicted of a terrorist act is potentially not the best way that the government could have approached, and I think there's going to be many disappointed Canadians with the government's decision to table this legislation today.
Okay, Monsieur Perdon, were you making a statement?
We'll just take questions in French and
English. First question, Katie Simpson, CTV.
You sort of just addressed it, but how comfortable are you with the idea that the man who was convicted of the Toronto 18 is going to have his citizenship handed back to him by the Government of Canada?
Well, I think it should be very concerning for the Canadian public. You know, I don't think that there's anyone who you could talk to in Canada who wouldn't be able to tell you the value of a Canadian citizenship. That's something that unites us all as Canadians. But there's certain responsibilities that are inherent to that, and that includes you know, not convicting or not committing terrorist acts. And you know, the minister sort of danced around the concept of what was the heart of this legislation, and that's that somebody who commits a very serious offense, terrorist acts like Zachariah Amara of the Toronto 18, there's something that should be said for that. And the fact that they're repealing this legislation, I think, is very short-sighted. And I'm just disappointed that this is the first bill on the order paper from this minister in this government. And the key beneficiary, again, is Zachariah Amara. There are many other groups in this country who would have been delighted to be talked about in the government's first piece of legislation. But make no mistake, this bill is a win for Zachariah Amara and not many other Canadians.
In his news conference just a short time ago, McCallum said, Minister McCallum called some of your decisions around the Citizenship Act egregious and stupid. Do you have any sort of response to the way he's discussed the conservative changes to the Citizenship Act?
Well, you know, as a legislator, I feel that one of my key responsibilities is to ensure the safety of Canadians. And I hope that that's something that all legislators, regardless of political stripe, would hold near and dear to their heart. I think when looking at the end results of this particular piece of legislation, which is to give back the citizenship of Zachariah Amara, I think there's a lot of Canadians who would question the government's judgment when it comes to protecting the safety of Canadians with this decision that they've made today.
Terry Milewski, CBC.
Thank you. First, I'd like you to address Mr. McCallum's comment that we won the election. We received a mandate to undertake these changes. As you know, it was a big issue in the election. Canadian is Canadian is Canadian was a big soundbite in one of the debates. It's not as though Canadians voted not knowing that the Liberals intended to abandon this revocation of citizenship. So doesn't he have a mandate to do it, just as he says?
Well, again, as I just said, I firmly believe that as legislators, we always have to be considering policy that keeps Canadians safe. And at the end of the day, I think that it's incumbent upon each one of us to look at the policy that we either put forward in an election or discuss here while we're on the Hill in session and ask, does it do that? And I think that the minister would be very challenged today to say that the end result of this policy is a safer Canada. And again, I'm surprised that this is the first piece of legislation, the first message that the government is sending in their mandate to Canadians is that our priority piece of legislation is to give the citizenship back to a man who was convicted of a plot to bomb downtown Toronto.
My follow-up relates to another comment of Mr. McCallum when he was asked on the stupidity question that was raised by my colleague. your party is in favor of attracting foreign students. Mr. McCallum said that if you had to ask him what the stupidest part of C-24 was, it was the abandonment of the 50% credit for foreign students. He's got a point, hasn't he? And it's your position on that, if you don't think it's stupid, is contrary to your policy.
Well, as I said earlier, we intend on reviewing the full scope of the bill in coming days. What my concern is with the timing of this bill right now, and some of the the concerns that you've just raised, is the government has not yet tabled their immigration levels report, and many of you know that that is the key piece of information that informs provincial governments, different stakeholder groups on what the government's plans are for amounts of people coming to Canada in different immigration streams. So, what I'll be looking for in this bill is how they plan to sort of reconcile some of the changes they've made here with the fact that they haven't exposed that information to the Canadian public yet. I know many people are asking for that. It's well beyond the latest it's ever been tabled. Even when a general election was held in 2008, this information was out in November, at the end of November of that year. So, without that piece of information, the timing of this bill, because it precedes that, as well as the fact that, it's quite obvious what the key issue is in this bill. I just find it surprising and a little disappointing.
Raymond Filion, TVA.
Bonjour, je peux vous entendre en français, peut-être M. Berthold. Votre réaction en quelques mots sur le fait que cette législation va redonner la citoyenneté à un homme condamné pour terrorisme. Qu'est-ce que les gens doivent penser de ça?
Ça en dit beaucoup sur les priorités de ce gouvernement. Je suis très, très surpris d'ailleurs que la toute première pièce de législation concernant la citoyenneté va redonner la citoyenneté à un homme, Zakaria Maria, qui fait partie d'un groupe, Toronto 18, qui a été, lui, reconnu coupable d'un geste contre la sécurité des Canadiens. C'est très préoccupant. Et c'est ce qui est étonnant aujourd'hui de voir que le premier geste en matière de citoyenneté de ce gouvernement-là, c'est de redonner sa citoyenneté à ce citoyen.
Par contre, M. McCallum, en conférence de presse, l'a dit à quelques reprises. Les Canadiens sont d'accord avec ça, a-t-il dit, parce qu'ils ont voté pour nous, ils nous ont donné un mandat majoritaire.
C'est une question de priorité, M. Filion. Vous savez, moi, je pense que le rôle d'un législateur, c'est de s'assurer que les citoyens au Canada soient dans un endroit sécuritaire. C'est ça, être citoyen canadien. C'est pour ça que beaucoup de gens partout dans le monde veulent devenir citoyens canadiens parce qu'ils savent qu'on est un pays sécuritaire. Et ce qu'on envoie comme signal aujourd'hui, c'est qu'on redonne à un citoyen qui a été reconnu coupable d'un geste contre la sécurité des Canadiens sa citoyenneté. Et je pense que c'est questionnable.
Michelle Zelia, Globe and Mail.
Yes, thanks for taking questions. Under this legislation, the government will no longer be able to revoke citizenship of someone who's been convicted of terrorism, for instance. However, they can still revoke citizenship for individuals convicted of citizenship fraud. Do you feel like the government is picking and choosing here?
Well, I noticed that, and I know that the minister was asked that question by one of your colleagues, and he frankly skated around that fact. I think what Canadians need to realize is they've decided that false representation or fraud is more serious than somebody who's been that's committed a terrorist act against Canada, and I think that they're really trying hard to square that circle, and they're not communicating that very effectively. I think that this was very poorly thought through. In some ways, I kind of feel sorry for the minister that he was given the mandate from the Prime Minister to put this forward as his first piece of legislation. And I think a lot of Canadians are going to ask the question that you just asked. There's a very disconnected message here, and I think a lack of cohesive policy.
So, as a follow-up, the minister also said, he keeps repeating, a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, and that this is about principle, even pertaining to this individual who's incarcerated in Toronto. What about the principles for your party? What does this legislation say?
Well, let's put partisanship aside for a moment and let's talk about principle. I think, there's many things that unite us as Canadians. And I think one of those things is a respect and a deep value for Canadian citizenship. Anybody who's ever been to a Canadian citizenship ceremony and watched someone take an oath of citizenship, I think, there's a deep understanding and pride of what it means to be Canadian at that moment. And so when we're talking about principle, I would like to think that the first principle that we put forward is that we're not celebrating people that commit terrorist actions against our country. And like, to put this in perspective, this isn't an esoteric academic exercise. There is somebody who has been convicted, as I said earlier, of a plot to bomb downtown Toronto, to inflict disaster on our country. And they are going to get their Zachariah Amara is going to get his citizenship back because of the Liberal government, their first piece of legislation in here. So when we talk about principle, I mean, there's a strong statement of principle in that action too, and that's what we take issue with as a party.
Tom Perry, CBC.
Right here. Do you believe then that there are two classes of Canadian citizens, ones who hold Canadian citizenship and one who hold dual nationality?
Well, as I just said earlier, I actually think that pride in Canadian citizenship is what unites us as one cohesive group in this country. And I think anybody who comes to Canada and takes a citizenship oath with malice in their heart against our country, I think that we have to question what that means in terms of how we as a country look at Canadian citizenship. This isn't about, class politics or something as the Liberals are trying to define it. This is there's an actual example here. There's an example of what this law means. When this passes, if the Liberal government passes this, Zachariah Amara gets his citizenship back. I'm not sure Canadians will be comfortable with that. And to me, the Liberals can dance around this with their talking points all they want, but at the end of the day, that's what this bill means, and I'm very uncomfortable with that.
So are dual nationals less Canadian than a straight-up Canadian citizen?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And we've never said that. The offenses that were listed under this bill were very serious offenses. Terrorist acts. Like, this isn't, this is a very serious offense against our country as a whole. And, to somehow try and tie that into what you just said, I think it's really disappointing, and it actually devalues a very important debate about public safety in this country.
You can't strip the citizenship of a Canadian citizen if they don't have dual nationality. So does that not automatically mean that there are two classes?
Well, I think that we have many policies in place. Like, our country is made up of people who have come to this country to build a life from around the world. My family's, I think we'd be hard-pressed to find anyone in this room who didn't have some ancestry of that or a direct, first-generation Canadian. The policies that we should be talking about are how we build our country up, how we ensure that people who are coming to Canada have the best experience possible. We've had that debate around the Syrian Refugee Initiative. But when it comes to some of the things that do unite us together, including a safe and healthy communities, that right to, pursue your freedom in knowing that you're going to be safe. A terrorist act, and it's a personal issue for me. I'm sure it's a personal issue for my colleague Erin. We experienced that in the House of Commons over a year ago. That's something I hope that Canadians never have to personally experience, that fear that we felt on that day. And if someone comes to Canada with that intent in their heart, I think it's a worthy discussion to say whether or not they have forfeited their Canadian citizenship in that moment. And that was the intent of this legislation when we passed it. It was to protect Canadians. It was to make sure that understanding, that value of Canadian citizenship, is celebrated. And I just, this is their first piece of legislation, and it's really surprising. Yeah, sure.
I just think it's important to note the Liberals have not ended revocation of citizenship. In 2009, the Harper government stripped the citizenship of two Nazi war criminals who had committed fraud on entry. The additions of crimes against the state were added. So what's happened here is they feel that revocation of citizenship should still exist in cases of fraudulent entry, but not in the narrow provisions of crimes against the state. And that is troubling. And I think that needs to be noted. Revocation could have been eliminated entirely if they're truly making their principled stand. They're opposing the small changes we made, which added crimes against the state, which are very unique at law, crimes against the state. particularly if you've made a pledge to your state. And my colleague, Ms. Rempel, said, if you're making an oath of citizenship with malice in your heart, that oath really is not worth what millions aspire it to be. So I think that needs to be certainly noted. Revocation is still in place and will take place for more minor transgressions like fraud.
Okay. Marc Godbout, Radio-Canada.
Monsieur Berthold, est-ce que le gouvernement commet une erreur? Parce qu'après tout, ça va un peu à l'opposé de ce que certains pays comme la France font en ce moment. Est-ce qu'il commet une erreur?
Moi, je pense que en ce moment, la pièce qui a été introduite va redonner sa nationalité à quelqu'un qui a commis un crime contre le Canada. Parce que le terrorisme, c'est un crime contre le Canada, c'est un crime contre tous les Canadiens. Puis à la fin, bien, si cette législation-là passe, Zakaria Maria va retrouver sa citoyenneté canadienne. Est-ce qu'on est d'accord comme pays à ce que quelqu'un qui vient dans notre pays, qui veut devenir Canadien dans son cœur, dans son être, commette ce genre de risque de crime-là? Je pense que la pièce de législation qui était en place permettait justement de garder cette valeur, garder ce niveau de sécurité aux Canadiens. Et c'est ce qu'on veut faire.
Mais là, vous parlez juste d'un point, vous n'arrêtez pas de parler de ce point-là, mais alors qu'il n'y a pas juste ce changement-là qui est proposé. Est-ce que vous croyez vraiment que le gouvernement va de l'avant tout simplement pour défaire quelque chose qui a été fait sous l'ancien gouvernement? Est-ce que vous croyez que c'est ça sa motivation principale?
Ben, sa motivation, je ne la comprends pas parce que sa première pièce de législation au niveau de la citoyenneté, c'est de redonner sa citoyenneté à un citoyen qui a été condamné pour un acte de terrorisme, qui voulait s'en prendre à des gens ici au Canada. Et ça, je peux le questionner. Ça m'interroge beaucoup sur les intentions du gouvernement.
Okay, Stephanie Levitz, CP.
When this bill was introduced, there were other, when you guys introduced C-24 rather, there were other elements in it that were of concern to ethnic Canadians, ethnic new Canadians, among them the revocation thing, because they said it was going to be a slippery slope, that one day you're going to put in terrorism as a grounds for revocation, and the next day it's going to be triple homicide. And there was this notion that the intent to provide provisions of your bill were also a barrier for new Canadians, because before you got your citizenship, you had to say, I promise I'm going to live in Canada. And many new Canadians were saying, well, does that mean if I can never leave, and then I'll lose my Canadian citizenship? So what's your message to them and these groups who had really feared that, you know, they understood why you might be doing certain elements, but that the slippery slope argument, that one day they could be just as at risk of losing their citizenship?
I would say that the intent of our party and our former government was always to ensure that Canada was the best place for anybody around the world to come to, you know, participate in our economy and our culture, to raise a family. And part of that aspect is safety. So, you know, I think that it's very important to note, as my colleague Mr. O'Toole mentioned, was that the provisions for revocation around terrorism were very narrow and very defined for, you know, essentially what is an act against the state. And, you know, that is, I think, something that needs to be emphasized over and over again. And then, you know, with regard to some of the other issues that you mentioned, you know, in terms of declaring residency in the country, you know, I would hope, and I think we all would hope, that when someone expresses the desire to be a Canadian citizen, that they were doing so because they want to bring their talents, their contribution, their family, their perspective to help build Canada, you know, build our pluralism and make it a better country, as so many millions have, you know, throughout our history. So, you know, I think that, you know, there's been a lot of inflammatory rhetoric from the Liberals on this, and I hope I am imparting to you something that's very serious. We're not talking, again, like I want to reemphasize, we're not talking about something that's academic that potentially could happen. This is about Zakaria Amara. And under this bill, he will get his citizenship back. And I think that the minister will have to answer to Canadians for that.